Hi, Sarah. Welcome. We're so happy to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, and today we're talking about rising up in our own identity, in our own dignity, and really fighting comparison. And this is just the common story. I mean, we are women, so there's that. And we also we have a long history with comparison. I mean,
Yes.
started way back when. And we continue to fight this topic and to really wrestle internally with this idea that maybe we've been given certain gifts, and maybe not some others. And we see other people who have those gifts. And so I would just love to hear from you. How do you see and observe women comparing themselves to other people?
Yeah, I think this is so prevalent in so many different areas of our life. And I think some of us, we can think about maybe what our homes look like, or our bodies, or our careers, or our relationships. We're constantly trying to measure up and see where we fit, if we measure up to the person next to us. And I think those can be some of the sort of more traditional ways that we can think about comparison. And those are huge issues. And I think also, in addition to those things, sometimes we can compare our suffering, right? Or we can compare even our sin. And we have this measure of, I'm so much worse than this person, or this person is so much worse than me, those issues too, I think can be a part of comparison. And so I think there's so many different areas where this issue of comparison touches. And like you said, this goes back thousands of years, right? And I think even now it can sometimes be even more prevalent, because even in these traditional ways of comparison, like your house or your body or whatever, social media has really put a spotlight on a lot of that, right? So maybe we used to compare what our homes looked like to the person next door, but we didn't actually know what their home looked like until we were in their home, right? And now it's like we know what people's inside of their homes. We know the meals that they are cooking because we're posting it on Instagram. We know, what somebody, is doing in their everyday life, or, we see these highlight reels that we tend to compare with. And I think that's another aspect of this comparison issue that we can really easily struggle with.
Because, as you said, it's the highlight reel. We're not really comparing ourselves to the inside of someone's house.
Right.
We're comparing it to the corner that's clean that they're showing us on Instagram.
And pretty.
Yeah. I mean, I'll speak for myself right here. I'm not going to show you guys what's on either side of this little box. It's a disaster around here. But right here, if you're just looking on YouTube on my little screen, you can't see the mess. And in some ways, I think that's almost worse, right? Because we have this perception now that we are seeing reality when we aren't. And so we're comparing ourselves to even more falsehoods, not just our imagination, but a false sense of reality. And oh, dang, that's hard.
I think too, even with that, I'm with you 100%, because we do forget the full reality and we don't see the full reality. But I think also comparison can keep us from actually celebrating others. And I know we'll talk about this more later, but from celebrating others when maybe they do have a certain gifting, or maybe their house actually isn't a mess. And the comparison is so ingrained in us that we then have to say, well, the rest of their house must be a mess, rather than saying, wow, that's really great for them. Do you know what I mean? It's like that comparison doesn't even allow us to celebrate, a gifting or some good in someone else's life. So it's like we see the highlight reel, which is true, and we forget the whole reality of what somebody's life may encompass. But then we also sometimes, I think, go the other direction and say, well, there must be something bad behind this, rather than saying that's really great for them. Let me celebrate them, and I think that's part of it too.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a friend who told me that she was talking to a man recently who had done some work for her, and they were having a little bit of a disagreement, and she said, I'm having a hard day. Could you be sensitive right now? Or could you kind of just lay a little bit off?
Yeah.
There's some other things going on in my life, is essentially what she was saying, that are kind of hard. So I'm feeling really tender right now, is what she said to him. And he just went off on her and said, you are not allowed, essentially, to have a bad day, because look at your life. And he was looking at certain external factors. And I think that story really stuck with me, because that was really hurtful to her. Like, I'm allowed to have a bad day, right? Like, you can't tell me that my feelings aren't, but we sometimes create this whole persona around a few details, and we compare ourselves to those details, and we forget the whole entirety, and it takes away humanity from each other. Like, it keeps us from caring for each other, because we let these details amplify in the comparison, and then we start to fester and get angry or resentful or hurt. And it really can become so toxic, and I'm trying to think of the right word. It's almost like it rots us inside, because we aren't allowed ourselves to welcome the whole person.
Exactly. That's one of the things that I've been sort of ruminating on a little bit, is this idea that comparison really hamstrings compassion. And we cannot have, like the story that you just told. It's like when we are comparing ourselves to others, it's like we can't have compassion for somebody who may be walking through something, because maybe we can't understand it, or our struggle is different, or we're just kind of seeing how we measure up. Or the flip side of it, that we can't have compassion for ourselves, because we're like, well, my struggle's not as bad as this person, which might be true. Like, we have to have perspective, right? But also, that comparison can sometimes keep us from having the compassion for ourselves that we need in order to get help, or in order to tend to our own wounds. And so comparison and compassion almost like can't coexist sometimes.
That's really good. I was even thinking, when you mentioned suffering, we even compare suffering or hardship. And a counselor told me one time, there's no hierarchy to pain. And so pain is pain, and you need to let yourself feel your pain, even if it's not the great pain of, someone living in the DRC who's a victim of war violence, right? But I'm curious how, because you've had suffering in your life, and I know this, I've read your book, and you do a beautiful job of really, really telling your story of the suffering that you've had. But I would just even love to hear how you've done that in your own life, because I do think we don't share because we don't think our hardship or suffering is kind of worthy of, depending on who we're talking to, right? So we might say, well, my hardship isn't as bad as hers, and so I really can't share. Or we don't have that compassion, and we negate what someone else is saying because it hasn't been as hard as ours.
Right.
So just how, I would love to hear, just even personally in your story, how you've dealt with that.
Yeah, one of the big pieces of this for me that I really wrestled with was when I was going through a season of depression, feeling like I am still kind of functional. And in hindsight, I wasn't as functional as I thought I was. But at the time, I was like, I'm not in bed all day, every day. I had my bad days, but I could still function throughout the day, kind of. And I was often comparing myself to other people that I knew that struggled, to the point where they had to be in an inpatient facility. And so a lot of that comparison for me was kind of like how dare I complain about this, or how dare I struggle with this? And again, I think it's important for us to have perspective, right? Like, breaking your leg is not as bad as losing a loved one, right? Like we know this in the sense, but at the same time, like you said, there's no hierarchy where one aspect of pain is more deserving of compassion than another. And as I was wrestling through my own depression, I just had to come to the point where, okay, like this struggle, even though it might not be as bad as the next person's, is still worth tending to because I am worth tending to. And I think sometimes our comparison is just this constant analysis of our own worth and our own security and our own value. And I think when we're able to start to rest in who we are and really know our worth, that comparison falls off the table. You know, we're not worried about, does this measure up? It's, hey, I'm struggling with this, and I'm allowed to get the help that I need. You know, I'm allowed to talk to somebody about this. I'm allowed to ask for prayer for this thing. And I really wrestled with that again, because I had some people in my life that I knew struggled even more profoundly. But then once I was actually able to get the help that I needed through counseling and then eventually through medication, I realized, wow, I was way more depressed than I thought I was. That was a big piece of it. Like I remember thinking after I was on medication for a season, thinking, oh my goodness, I forgot what it was like to feel normal. And in the midst of that depression, I was so focused on mine is not as bad as the next person's that it kept me from getting the help that I needed. And then once I was able to get that help, yeah, I really realized how much more deeply I struggled than I initially thought. But at the same time, you know, what good is it for me to sit there wallowing in my own struggle and not getting help? Like that doesn't help anybody. And me failing to be compassionate to myself keeps me from also then being able to be compassionate to others, or be able to, you know, it's rested people who can help others rest, right? And so when we are freed and we can rest in who we are and we can get rid of these burdens like comparison, we can actually then help serve others and help, you know, others find that same type of rest, because we are a person who has rested from those burdens. So that comparison of suffering was something that I definitely wrestled with.
That whole idea that when we are whole, that grows everything good in us, right? It grows more compassion so that we can, you know, be just like truly authentically available to the people around us.
Yeah.
It builds our patience. It builds our love capacity. And so there's so much wisdom in what you're saying. And I was talking to a book club last night who was doing my book, and they asked me if I'd come, and they said, what advice do you have for us kind of younger moms? And I was like, keep your center. Like, you have to do what you need to do to make sure that you are anchored and whole and healed in your own self, because that truly is the best thing you can do to create health in your family and in your parenting and in your marriage. And right, because we have to do that inner work, or not everything's going to feel off in our lives, because peace is something we carry, right? It's inside of us. And the great work that we do is cultivating that peace inside of ourselves and receiving that love from God, letting him heal us, getting to the right places and people, and allowing other people in, right? All of that contributes to this wholeness inside of us. So I would just love to get practical. And, you know, if there is, let's say, an area, let's just use genetics even as just because I think this is one people can relate to. You're given your genetics, and that's what you've got, and you don't have any, you know, really control over what your genetics are. But let's say someone is really struggling with comparing, especially maybe as people are approaching midlife and things don't quite look the way they used to. Things are harder than they used to be. I mean, let's even just talk physically. I mean, how would you recommend someone moves past that? Because everywhere they go, they're not maybe feeling as good as they once did. And everywhere they go, they're seeing people who still look really good because their genetic pool is different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so hard. I think I think if we don't understand our intrinsic value and worth, anything that we do to kind of try to measure up will eventually fade away, right? It's like you said, like we have to come back to, who did God make us to be? What does he have to say about us? Because if we don't actually understand that, anything else we try, the diet, the new clothes, the improving ourselves, which some of those can be fine, but that eventually will ring hollow, because it's always going to be this striving. And that's, I think, where this exhaustion comes in. And that's where, I talk in the book about these things being burdens that weigh us down, that wear us out, because again, it's this constant striving. It's even like this striving to be at peace, which is such an oxymoron, that doesn't make sense. And if we don't understand that we are deeply loved by God, and that we have intrinsic value and worth because of who he made us to be, everything else will ring hollow. And so we have to be able to come back to the truth of who God said we are and who he is, right? Because we also have to understand that God is good and compassionate and generous and loving. And, in Psalm 34, he talks about those who fear the Lord lack no good thing, and it's like, do we actually believe that? Because, maybe I'm measuring my life up to the person next to me, and it certainly feels like I lack some things. And do I actually believe that I am who God says I am, and God is who he says he is? And I think when we get rooted in those two truths, then we can start to deal with some of these very practical aspects of comparison in our everyday life. And so, even thinking about our body image, or how we view what we look like, what does God say about who we are? And because we have worth and value, then I am worth taking care of. And I think that's the other piece of it is we can talk about self-care, and we can talk about, working on our physical bodies. And if that's not coming out of a sense of our worth and value, it again will always be this striving. But when it is coming out of a sense of worth and value, we are doing that with a sense of freedom and joy that we can't have otherwise. I get to move my body and fuel my body with things that are good, and things that delight, and things that, allow me to do the things that God has called me to do, instead of striving to just look a certain way, or be a certain way, or compare myself to somebody else. And without that rootedness in who God is and who he says we are, again, like it's all going to end up being striving and exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that is a process that you have to keep going back to, as far as the identity reminder? Because I think I've spent a lot of years thinking, well, when I get to that point, like it's a place that I'll arrive at, and then I'll be there. But I'm realizing, no, this 100%, is a daily, even hourly practice of, okay, I'm feeling that comparison bubble up. It's time to remember my value and where it comes from. Would you say that's true for both of you?
100%, 100%. And I think, every situation in life can bring that comparison. Launching a book, I mean, you both know, I mean, that is just comparison central, looking at numbers and all that kind of stuff. It's such a ripe opportunity for comparison. And so for me, having, just released a book, that I'm like, okay, I'm having to come back. I actually, had to go back to some of these other authors that I had referenced in my own book to remember and to remind myself of that exact thing. So 100%. It's I think a lifelong lesson. I think we can learn to go back to the truth more quickly, which is good. I think God helps us to remember the truth, I think, a little bit more quickly as we move along. But I think it's just a constant learning process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was also thinking in that the more we focus on it, the worse it gets, right? The more it becomes almost this obsessive thinking And so where can we turn our thoughts that are different? I mean, just like how I think this is not a place we ever arrive. Just like mindset work. Mindset work is a process. It's not an outcome. Like you don't just all of a sudden go, okay, today I'm going to start thinking this. And now forever and always I'm going to think that. Like, nope,
Right.
it's like every day I have to revisit. And so I'm even thinking practically, like, how are we revisiting the proper mindset about things, and what are we telling ourselves? What's the narrative? Because if we're constantly telling ourselves, I'm not as pretty, I'm never going to lose weight, my body's never going to look good again, right? All the things, whatever, just because we're on that topic, I'm using those as examples, really fill in the blank with any topic. But those are the lies. And the more we focus on those, the more we actually believe them more. And so we have to really be proactive and not reactive. We have to be proactive of, no, what is the truth? Let's call out the lie. What is the truth here? And how can I start speaking that truth? Put it on my mirror, literally say it out loud. Like I have statements that I have that I keep up and I say them out loud and I practice because I'm working on this whole thing of, I want to have a strong mindset. And I do want to be like, who do I want to be? I want to be a person who's able to celebrate others, who's able to say, thank you, God, for this day, for this body, for these talents, for the, everything that you've given me today, this portion and cup, I am thankful for it. And I want to steward that. But to do that, I have to be in the right frame of mind, right? That has to, just is such a like daily thing. So I'm wondering, do you have anything in your daily ritual that helps you in regards to this?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head actually with my answer for this, because my whole entire book actually started with homework from my counselor to write down lies and to write down truth next to it. And that eventually became this book, which was not my intention originally, but that, I mean, having to literally, and I grew up in the church, and I grew up hearing a lot of these things, but there's something about me having to actually write it down and put it somewhere where I could see it regularly. I mean, that was a very practical tool for me that I still have to return to. And writing down these lies that I'm believing and writing down what is the actual truth about these things. And then with that, having other people in your circle who can speak that truth to you. Because there are so many times where I can talk myself out of the truth. And I need somebody else to come in. And for me, it was a counselor and my husband and other, friends who understood also some of the mental health issues that I was struggling with too, and could offer that compassion. And being able to have those people who can speak that truth into your life, because when you are, at least for me, when I was in those real dark seasons, or sometimes not necessarily dark with depression, but just really kind of spiraling with those lies, it was really hard to convince myself otherwise. And when when your body and your soul is just feeling so down, you need people from the outside to literally pull you out of that. So I think, knowing and believing those lies, but also not doing that, or knowing and believing the truth, that speaks to those lies, but also not doing that by yourself, I think is so, so important.
Yeah. And I was thinking too, that surrounding yourself with people who also don't tend towards comparison. I mean, we've confessed, we all struggle with it, right? But to surround yourself with people who also are trying to walk in that identity of truth and not create a culture of comparison within friendships and relationships, I think that can be so helpful. Not only can they help you, but it just kind of sets the tone that this isn't how we operate. We don't operate this way.
Yep. Yeah. I think for me, some of that too, in order to surround yourself with that kind of people, there is an element of somebody's got to go first, even to offer, like, I'm struggling to believe the truth, or I'm struggling with this aspect of comparison. And that can be a real tricky, messy space to navigate sometimes, because you also, at least initially, you don't necessarily know how people are going to respond if you don't have those people in your life already. And I think that can be really hard too, but there's also a level of vulnerability that's required in order to go first and to even allow those people to come into your life.
Would you be willing to share a sentence or two that you put up that was really helpful to you? I know for me, like one of my sentences that I'm practicing is I am comfortable being uncomfortable, because I'm really like working on doing some uncomfortable things right now. So like, that's just like something I'm saying, but are there a couple that you can throw out?
Yeah. I off the top of my head, I don't have my own sentence that I've written, but there's one quote, if you're okay, if this answers your question, but there's one quote from Tim Keller that I have, it's a little bit long. Otherwise I'd have it probably tattooed on myself, but this I have returned to over and over again. I've like printed it out. And in his book, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness, which I read at least once a year, it's about 65 pages. It's fantastic. He says, wouldn't you like to be the skater who wins silver and yet is thrilled about those 3 triple jumps that the gold medal winner did? To love it the way you love a sunrise, just to love the fact that it was done, for it not to matter whether it was their success or your success, not to care if they did it or you did it. You are as happy that they did it as if you had done it yourself, because you are just so happy to see it. And that has and in his book, he talks a little bit more about the why behind that and the foundation behind that. But understanding that we have a good and generous God. And so because of that, and because I have worth and value, and the person next to me has worth and value given to us by a good creator, I get to look at what somebody else has done or accomplished or has, and get to say, that's amazing. And I get to celebrate them because of that. And in that way, sort of partake in their joy. Like I get to be a part of that. And I think comparison steals that from us. And then we end up spiraling down into these lies that, I'm not as good as them, or they're not as good as me, or, whatever direction we can take those lies, because we are so concerned with how we measure up, or how they measure up to us, or making sure that everybody gets what we think they deserve. But when we come back to who God is and who he's created us to be, we get to instead celebrate somebody else's joy as if it were our own. And I think that is such a freeing place to be, when we get to then share in each other's joy, and at the same time also share in each other's pain, where we're not carrying our burdens alone. We get to actually carry each other's burdens without, comparison tripping us up along the way.
And then it creates that spiral of generosity with each other. It reminded me when you were talking just yesterday, my friend's son plays D1 football, and he's just been riddled with injuries. It's like every time he just starts to get back on the field and get there, he gets injured again. And he was interviewed. They're doing like a camp right now, the spring camp. And he was interviewed by the news press. And I actually got tears when I read this. This is what he wrote. I want to read it to you. He said, they were saying, like, how do you feel about, being injured all the time and this other kid playing in front of you? And he said, I know God has got a plan for me, and the same God does for him too. And mine happened to be not being on the field last year. And now it happens to be being on the field this year. And I was just like, okay, this is a college kid.
Wow. Yeah.
Like, is that so powerful? Like, he's like, you know what? The same God has a plan for me and has a plan for him. And I'm just going to trust that. And the plan was for me not to be out there last year. And now I'm better, and I'm back on the field this year, and I'm going to trust that plan. And he's like, I love that. And the interview went on to say, he's like, I love that kid. I love that teammate. Like, we're really good friends in the locker room, and I celebrate him and the role that he's playing on the team. And I'm like, okay, that is who I want to be, right? Like, that is a win, 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 win. Like, what a generous mentality that we can bring to the table, and think of how that impacts his team. Like, think of how contagious that must be on his football team. And like, we got our own football teams, like everywhere we go, we've got our own teams that we get to influence in that way. Isn't that beautiful?
I love that. I love that. And it reminds me of Eugene Peterson said something to the effect of Christian maturity is not about doing more for God, but it's God doing more in and through us. And like, as we grow up into maturity, it's not like I've accomplished these things or I've done these things or I've, measured up in this way, but God is actually working in and through us. And like, that's so exemplified in that college student, because look at how God is working and then using that to impact the team and us sitting here, that's having an impact on us and listeners. And that is what God calls us to do, is to live out that faithfulness with whatever he has given us, whatever lives or bodies or relationships or kids, whatever it is, it's our call is to live our lives faithfully to him and doing what he has called us to do. And that's it. That is what our life's work is. And that's, I think, what God has been stripping me of my own, mentality of I have to do more, because I have to even sometimes do more for God, and God's like, no, like I'm going to force you in some ways to rest and to slow down, or to give you some things in your life that are going to force you to reckon with me working in and through you, not you necessarily working for me. If that makes sense.
When you were reading that Tim Keller quote, I thought, for a lot of us, probably the place where we most naturally experience that is with our own kids. For those of us that are parents, that we have that sense of, if you do it better than me, awesome. If you like, I'm willing to celebrate all of your accomplishments. And I find as much, if not more, joy in that. And it's probably because as parents, God gives us a glimpse of his heart towards us as our parent. And so I wonder, for me, if I can harness some of that and say, okay, I know how this feels when it just naturally comes out of me for my own child. How can I use that muscle memory a little bit in some other relationships where it maybe doesn't come as naturally? And to have that spark of, I know I can do it because I've experienced it as a mom. So how can I then rise and meet the moment when I'm feeling a little bit of comparison with somebody else and say, no, that same thing I do with my kids, I can do with this person.
Yeah. I think one of the things too, for me is noticing, like you said, like noticing when we sense that comparison. Cause I think sometimes in the past, I have not noticed it until way far down the road. And I think as the Lord has been working on me with this issue, just noticing it earlier and then addressing it earlier, and even just naming that a little bit earlier. And so, then I can say, as I'm, noticing something and feeling that comparison, I could say, what is really bothering me about this? Is it because I'm actually really insecure? Or is it because I think they don't deserve that thing that they got? Or like, what is behind this sense of comparison? And, even just with our kids, I love that, because my kids are younger than your guys's, but I'm just noticing that more and more as they do more things and sharing in that joy. And I think when we get to do that with other people, then we're not just sort of nitpicking about, they didn't deserve this or whatever the case may be, but we're again able to share in that joy in a really, really beautiful way. But again, it takes sometimes that constantly learning to notice those feelings of comparison. And I think the Lord and the Holy Spirit, helps us see that, more and more as we grow up into Christian maturity.
Well, and then the discipline, like I always, if I'm feeling that way, I intentionally go and bless that person. Like I encourage them, I celebrate them, right? So like the discipline of like, nope, this isn't going to win. This thought, this feeling, I'm not going to be about that. I'm going to be about this. And then acting on that has really been helpful for me in the journey of comparison, because it's like in defiance of it almost,
Absolutely. I think that celebrating others and complimenting them and sharing their joy in a very tangible way. There's a little bit for me I hesitate to say this because I don't want it to sound like I'm advocating for people being disingenuous, but there's a little bit of a fake it till you make it. In the sense of like, I am comparing myself to them. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to shout their accomplishment from the rooftop. And I think that actually really does, like you said, like that blesses them. That actually blesses me. It helps rebel against that sense of comparison. Like you said, I noticed that with book stuff, that's definitely been a case for me, just in writing and all of that. And a lot of times I struggled to share other people's work, and the Lord really worked on me. And as I was working on a book proposal that never has come to be, I mean, this was 6 years ago, and the book proposal is still collecting digital dust. Other people were launching a book on the same topic. And I really struggle with that sense of comparison. And it was like, why isn't my book going anywhere? Why isn't this happening? And I remember just this Holy Spirit just sense in my heart and my mind that was just saying, is the most important thing that the word and the message gets out, or that I get to be the one to say it? And I realized for me at that time, it was more important to me that I got to be the one to say that particular message, not that it got out. And when the Lord started to shift that for me, I was able to say, okay, no, the most important thing is actually that this message gets out. And so now my job is different. Now I get to take a megaphone and shout this message that other people are sharing, and point them to their books and point them to their work. And maybe that's actually what my job is. And that has actually been such a lesson for me, because it has been very humbling, but also I've actually grown some great relationships through that with people that 6 years later have shared my work, and it wasn't in a sense of I was sharing it just so that they'd share my work 6 years later, but there's a relationship that comes when we're not so focused on comparing ourselves to each other. And when we get to share in each other's joy instead. And so when I shifted, or when God shifted that in my heart, I was able to share their words from the rooftops and shout what they had to say. And that was honestly so much more fun, right? Like, it's so much more fun
So good
to celebrate others than to sit there wallowing in my own comparison.
Amen. I actually was just studying this with some coaching stuff I'm doing, some training. And the way they put it was, significance and selfishness can't coexist in a leader. That if there's selfishness, the leader will not be significant. But if they're significant, they almost always are successful. And so like that flip, and what you described was exactly it. Like that maturity to get to that place. It's so good, Sarah. Oh my gosh. Well, this is all a part of your book. So why don't you just give people a little snapshot of what else is in your book?
Yeah. So the book is called All Who Are Weary, Finding True Rest by Letting Go of the Burdens You Were Never Meant to Carry. And in the book, it's sort of rooted in Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, right? And that's a passage that's very familiar to us. And so what I look at is 9 different burdens that I have felt and carried myself, and what does it look like to actually set down those burdens and carry what we are called to carry instead, and to find rest by letting go of all these things that are tripping us up and wearing us out, things like comparison and insecurity and condemnation, and these burdens that we carry that we were never meant to carry. We don't need to carry, and we can let those go. And so that's kind of the gist of the book. And then in the last chapter, I do talk about what is it that we carry instead, and what does it mean to carry our cross and carry each other's burdens along the way.
Love it. Well, I've read it, and you are a beautiful writer, and I cannot recommend the book enough.
Thank you, Krista.
It's fantastic. It truly is. I told you before we started recording, I cried lots of times in the book, and it just touched me deeply. And so that's what that shows, is it touched me. Your writing really touches, I think, everyone that reads it. And so thank you for the gift of your book, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. That means a lot to me.
Okay. Thanks again for being on today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.